Thank you, and good morning to everybody. It's good to see you all here in Helsinki, and I wish you, for my part, welcome to this symposium. Dear colleagues and friends, when my predecessor Jukka Liedes, the grand man of copyright in Finland and the chair of the Finnish Copyright Society organizing this symposium, told me my topic of my address, I thought, great, this will be easy. After all, the only development concerning the copyright legislation since the 2015 Nordic Symposium has been the entry into force of the Act on Collective Management of Copyright. The other developments have taken place at the European Union level in Brussels. At least that's how it feels at the moment in our daily work. So that was not the whole truth, after all. Immediately after the Reykjavik Symposium in May 2015, not only one, but two new amendments to the Copyright Act came into force in Finland. And I will now briefly describe the main points of these amendments. But first, a little bit back in time. In autumn 2014, the government issued three proposals to amend the Copyright Act. The first and most urgent one amended our system of fair compensation so that compensation for private copying is nowadays paid from an allocation included in the state budget. This came into force on the 1st of January 2015. Regarding private copying, it was decided by the government, after careful consideration and weighing of options, that compensation will be paid from the state budget. It was clearly a political solution. The previous system of private copying levies was difficult to keep up to date to cover all devices that were used for private copying. The results of the newest survey on private copying in 2017 show that private copying is in a deep slide caused by music streaming services. And at some point, the decreasing amount of private copying will be eventually reflected in the size of the allocation in the state budget. Now, let's take a closer look at the amendments which came into force in summer 2015. What do these amendments actually mean in the context of the whole copyright system and legislation? The first amendment to the Act, the provision of online recording services of television programs, is based on extended collective license. It means that telecommunication service providers and ECL organizations can agree on the online recording of television programs. It is a holistic approach created in collaboration between copyright holders, television broadcasting companies, and providers of online recording services. We knew already at the beginning that the right to prohibit the use of a program should be incorporated into the legal solution in the Act. It was formulated so that only producers may use that right. We also anticipated that the right to prohibit could create problems in practice. Blocking of certain programs from the program flow will not be easy, especially if the program information is incomplete. The second item, the clarification of the general provisions on extended collective license, aimed to reinforce the legal basis of the system of extended collective license. The provision reads as follows nowadays. An approved organization is, with regard to this agreement, deemed to represent the authors of other works in the same field. There was a clear need for this clarification, for instance, because of the way the European Commission has viewed the system of extended collective license. The third item, the provisions on the adjustment of unreasonable conditions in agreements on copyright transfers were fine-tuned and reintroduced from the General Agreements legislation back to the Copyright Act. The aim was to influence agreement practices in different fields and to increase awareness of the possibility to adjust unreasonable agreements and their conditions. This compromise was a response to the need to protect the weaker party in copyright agreements. The fourth item, the issue of how to tackle copyright infringements online, has been on the agenda ever since the introduction of the Information Society Directive and the Enforcement Directive. It was a good step forward to introduce a blocking order against unknown administrators or websites that are making available material in violation of copyright. However, another problem did land in our laps last year. According to Section 60A of the Copyright Act, an author or his representative is entitled, by the order of the Market Court, to obtain contact information from the telecommunications service provider about a telesubscriber who, without authorization, makes copyright-protected material available to the public. The wording of the provision from 2005 has in practice meant that relatively little evidence has been enough to convince the Market Court. And there have been even cases where easily a year or more has elapsed between the alleged infringement and a contact by letter from the author's representative. In 2005, no one could foresee how this provision would be applied in practice later. The Ministry of Education and Culture has now appointed a working group with authorities, copyright holders, senders of the letters, and consumers to discover how to safeguard the rights of copyright holders in ways that are more reasonable from the point of view of the consumers who receive these kind of letters. Another goal is to find new best practices for the field. And if other means fail, the final option is to consider amending the legislation somehow. And finally, the fifth item. A new point of attachment was inserted for the protection of phonograms. The eligibility for protection is now based both on the country where the phonogram was made and the nationality of the producer of the phonogram. This amendment is probably the least troublesome of these. Extending the criteria for protection was seen necessary because nowadays phonograms may be results, for instance, of several collaborations, and parts of phonograms may be recorded in more than one country. Then, a few words about the second act amending the Copyright Act. It took nearly a decade to introduce the right to remuneration for the retransmission of television programs back to the Copyright Act. The last push came from the European Commission when it sent a letter of formal notice to Finland requesting us to ensure that the correct implementation of the directive. The reintroduction of the right to remuneration has later brought forward some fundamental questions, such as: do cable providers retransmit programs of Finnish television channels? And have broadcasting companies been able to get all the necessary rights for initial transmission on cable networks? We did not get any final answers to these questions when the amendment was prepared. And then the most recent amendment, which came into force at the beginning of this year. The amount of public lending remuneration in the state budget has increased in last year, so that this year the amount is about 50 million euros. And from the beginning of this year, the remuneration covers also loans from university libraries. Ladies and gentlemen, The time listed for my address is running out. The Act on Collective Management of Copyright involves such a big package that there's no time to go any further into details. However, this directive-based act will likely introduce much needed uniform European practices, but also a lot of new things to consider in the daily work of collective management organizations. It will take a few years before we see how the directive and the act are functioning. We in Finland are currently working hard on the Commission's initiatives in the copyright field, as are our colleagues in other EU member states. This means that at the moment we have little resources to invest in the development of purely national copyright legislation, even in those cases where it would be possible and desired. However, copyright is and continues to be the means of ensuring economic activities in the creative sectors, as our Minister already stated. This is also the reason why we are here today in this Nordic Symposium. Thank you for your attention.